Daggerdale is the only D&D video game where you can play it, but why would you do that to yourself? Only slightly more entertaining than constipation, and a damn sight worse than banging your shin on a coffee table. This is not the D&D we used to play. Dungeons & Dragons video games have always been a bit of a mixed bag. For every Baldur's Gate and Neverwinter Nights that go down as classics, you'll also find a Sword Coast Legends that fumbles with the iconic IP. But according to Metacritic, one D&D game stands head and shoulders above the others in terms of just how bad it is. Daggerdale was created in 2011 by Bedlam Games, who also released Gamma World in that same year before shutting down completely. Big year for them. Daggerdale is a bad game. I wish I could say it was funny bad, but in the end it was mostly boring bad, and I have to say it was extremely forgettable. And I know it was forgettable because when I went to buy it to make this video, I discovered that I apparently already owned it and had played it for 6 hours in 2013. Wild. And I will point out that although this is a reviled game, a lot of articles actually call the 1988 Heroes of the Lance game to be the actual worst D&D game. As near as I can tell, there are fan-made PC ports, so, 300 likes on this video, and I will do everything in my power to try and get it up and running for a video. Now, getting Daggerdale working can be a challenge for some users. It's a renowned mess of bugs. And I've seen one mention in a Steam review that the dev team had been laid off just before launch, which would honestly explain the lack of bug fixing. But the studio died with such a whimper that I wasn't actually able to confirm much of anything about this. Regardless, I didn't run into any game-breaking bugs, but according to the Steam reviews, they certainly exist. The other barrier of entry is more of a skill test that a lot of users didn't clear. The game asks you to sign into GameSpy on launch, which no longer exists as of nearly a decade ago. But, there's a cancel button. I don't really know if the commenters didn't just try hitting the cancel button, or if that was patched in at a later date, but with both GameSpy and Bedlam being dead, I don't know who would have made that patch. The multiplayer co-op was one of the redeeming features of this game. So with GameSpy dead, that actually leaves us with only single player to work with. You've got 4 classes to choose from, with very little beyond that in the way of customization. Halfling Wizard, Human Fighter, Elf Rogue, and Dwarf Cleric. I made a point of doing the tutorial as each class, but I did my main playthrough as a Halfling Wizard, and I did that purely because wizards are my favorite D&D class. Now they do let you do some actual D&D stuff with your character mechanics, choosing spells, feats, and eventually increasing your attributes. In theory, Daggerdale was based on the 4th edition of D&D, but in practice, it's so far removed from how the tabletop version goes that it's effectively editionless, but not in a good way. The 4th edition was D&D at its most tactical, but Daggerdale is a hack-and-slash game, so there's very little the two actually take from one another beyond spell names. Okay, the opening cutscene is the majority of the story you're going to get out of this game, so let's see what our premise is.
Do not be alarmed. I am Lauren Aria. Sadly, we've no time for long explanations. Daggerdale is under threat. Heroes, you have been summoned here to defeat Restless, a powerful Zentarum and loyal servant of Bane, the Lord of Darkness. Restless is amassing an army to conquer Daggerdale. To this aim, he has constructed the Tower of the Void at the heart of this mine. Find the tower entrance. Scale its height and face its perils until you find Restless himself.
As you can tell, the story isn't much to write home about. There's a big bad evil guy, and you're an adventurer, so I guess it's time to go do some adventurer shit. But do you know who the real heroes of this story are? Not the adventurers, but the patrons. We have a new one this month, so thanks to Tech Priest Melodious for joining the crew. If you would like to appear in the monthly patron credit roll, then I'll have a link in the description. This week, I also have one of the new perks activated for Tier 2 patrons. So if you wanted printable rules and assets for an actual role-playing game that was invented and played 800 years ago in Norman England, then sign up on Patreon for the PDF. Alright, enough. We have a video game to dunk on. You get dropped off in the mines, and begin hacking and slashing your way through Tethyamar with the remnants of the dwarves who lived here before their home became a plot hook. Entering the game of Daggerdale feels a bit like waking up with a hangover. Everything just feels bad, real bad, and you can do some things to make it less bad, but nothing's going to make it feel good. The first thing that everyone notices is the camera. I found it to be so awful that within minutes I resolved myself to completely abandon the mouse and keyboard and try using a gamepad instead. This thankfully reduced the horrors a little bit, but it didn't eliminate my camera woes completely. You get to swap between two camera angles, a close-up and a zoomed out. Neither of them are any good at all, because the camera rotation is the problem, not the distance. To me, it feels like rather than having a full 360 rotation system, the designers made it so that you could only pivot every 15 degrees or so, and the result, it just doesn't feel good. And that's not to mention the way that every time you're near doors and bridges and stuff, the camera just leaves your control entirely. I often had to run away from encounters just so I could find a place where the game would actually let me rotate the camera so I could see who I was fighting. You'll get used to it eventually, but it's never gonna feel great. The visuals that go alongside the camera are pretty poor too. I'm trying to grade this part of the video on a curve since I obviously can't compare a low-budget 2011 game with Elden Ring, but I mean, even in a trial of its peers, Daggerdale looks bad. It looks significantly worse than Dark Souls, which came out that exact same year. And it also fails to keep up with Dragon Age Origins, which came out 2 years earlier. I was struggling for a little while to come up with something fair to compare it to since the budget was clearly pretty low on this thing, and then it hit me. Graphically, it looks only the slightest bit better than the 2003 Return of the King game, but with significantly worse art direction. Being that Daggerdale manages to stack up poorly even compared to a game from nearly a decade before, I'm just gonna call it here. Daggerdale's graphics are bad, and the frequent texture bugs make it even worse. And it says a lot that despite all of this, the graphics are still probably one of the game's strongest elements. Really, it's between either that or the soundtrack, which manages to only be boring, not necessarily bad. It's pretty much just all basic fantasy music, which would have actually been fine in almost any other game. But when Daggerdale is so painfully dull, boring music becomes a much bigger problem. We needed something that could stand out, literally anything. The sound effects are also worth critiquing, because with combat feeling as dull as it does, the sound has to bear some responsibility. Sound effects can really add impact and make weapons and spells feel good. In this case, they mostly just don't. They're kinda just sorta there, and nothing sounds particularly satisfying. The one exception I found was the spell that actually made me start enjoying the game. My lightning snake spell sounded like it had actual impact, and that greatly improved my gameplay experience. That said, even this spell managed to sound quite blunted when you were in a larger fight. So, with enemies being giant hit sponges and the attacks and spells sounding like they're barely even happening, it combines to make the gameplay feel even worse. So, about that terrible gameplay. Up until this morning, I had a lot worse things to say about it, but I've come around a little bit. A lot of the shortcomings seem to be down to the fact that the game intends you to do this as a multiplayer experience. Most of the positive Steam reviews talk about it being a fun co-op game, but being that the co-op feature is dead, I mean, that sort of wrecks the entire experience, doesn't it? Health pools are clearly optimized under the assumption that there are multiple players smacking these enemies, so single-player fights just feel like a slog. This is made worse by the fact that there aren't any difficulty options, by the way. Additionally, the classes all have glaring weaknesses that you're supposed to have help solving. I spent my playthrough on my wizard thinking that the class just felt really bad, in that I had very few ways to actually do wizard stuff. Enemies just blindly charge at you, and the teleport spell doesn't grant you too much distance to spellcast. And, I mean, that's when it doesn't glitch out and just rocket you up in the air. I actually ended up needing to buy a feat that let me do melee with my intelligence modifier instead of my strength, just so that I could slap people around with my staff instead of suffering through failing to kite enemies again and again and again. My assumption was that Daggerdale was just a melee-focused game, and that I had been playing it wrong by trying to do nothing but spell sling. Eventually, I got the Lightning Serpent spell, which is like a chain lightning thing that slows everyone, and when I combined that with an AoE freeze that was pretty hard to line up otherwise, I suddenly found that I could spell sling and the game was so much more fun. That only happened in the last 20% of the game though, so unfortunately I spent the bulk of my experience as a discount fighter. Or so I thought. Because just to cover my bases, this morning I tried to replay the first act as a human fighter, and I'm very glad I did. In my wizard playthrough, I thought Daggerdale was a melee game, and I just made the wrong choice. Fighter seemed like it was how the game actually wanted you to play. But what I realized is that fighters had their own problems. Yes, your weapon attacks can clear rooms in an instant, but you know what you can't do like a wizard or a rogue? You can't use your special to avoid damage, and you can't heal like a cleric. All you get is a shield block, and it's completely useless. You can't move when you're in that block, and I mean, this ain't Dark Souls, so it's almost impossible to time your blocks correctly to avoid damage. You were in danger when you started the block, and you're in the same danger when you leave the block. All this together means that fighters take a lot of damage, and it's very noticeable. My wizard's teleport made melee combat trivial, because I could lay the smack down and then teleport out of bad situations. But the fighter just has to take it. It's a battle of attrition, really. However, both of these problems are supposed to be solved by the multiplayer. The wizard is supposed to have someone who can tank, and the fighter is supposed to have a cleric who can heal them. Or at least have someone who can help disrupt the enemies a bit more. I also noticed that the rogue seems to be built for backstabbing and flanking, but flanking with who? So I have to be a bit kinder to the gameplay than perhaps I want to. It's optimized for a game mode that isn't possible anymore. So should we forgive those failures completely and accept the game for what it is? No, we absolutely should not. This is a co-op game where the co-op is no longer possible. It's fundamentally broken, and it's very hard to get any value out of this. The fact that it's still $15 on Steam is criminal. This is a scam. It's $15 abandonware that's just cashing in on the D&D license. Do not buy this game. Do not play this game. It sucks, and it's not fun. They aren't selling you a game. They're selling you the words Dungeons and Dragons. Daggerdale is a D&D NFT that you can hurt yourself with if you want to. Okay, so that's my recommendation. Do not buy this game. And if you discover that it was forgotten in your Steam library like I did, please continue to ignore it. However, there is still more to cover in this video. The story, the world, You arrive in Tethyamar and immediately begin assisting the dwarves hoping to reclaim the mines. What are you helping them against? Goblins. So many goblins. So many. Oh my god, too many goblins. The game is structured around 3 dungeons that change a little bit over time. They aren't huge dungeons, so you will be backtracking a lot. However, things change enough, and the acts are also short enough that it won't actually bug you too much. The first map has a small dwarven hold, and as you start solving the goblin problems, certain areas will end up getting reclaimed. it's actually kind of satisfying, but I would have liked to have seen more out of that system. The visuals in these areas are all brown and boring, and combined with the fact that you'll be fighting the same enemies over and over with very little variety, it honestly makes the whole thing feel like a drag. To get to the Tower of Restless, the dwarves need to open up a gate that they've kept sealed off to keep the hordes out, which, they might want to get a refund on that gate, honestly. As you gather parts of broken mechanisms, a poison sets in that drives dwarven workers into a frenzy. You investigate and connect it to some gray powder. After you've solved a bunch of problems, the dwarves open up the gate, only to reveal that the goblins were there waiting in ambush. After the carnage, one of the dwarven leaders is imprisoned for tipping off Restless after the gray powder is discovered in his things. After that, you move into a third area, which is where... Okay, you know what? I'm just gonna be straight with you guys. Act 2 is so unbelievably boring that I barely remember it. We find out that the dwarf who was the traitor wasn't the dwarf who was the traitor, and it was a different dwarf who was the traitor. And then we do a bunch of fetch quest things to summon a boss. And the boss is pretty cool. He's a big skull guy. He was interesting, actually, but I'm not quite certain how I killed him. It seemed like he died when all the pillars fell, but it was hard to tell, actually. It was actually kind of a letdown. The game pits you against the first interesting fight in the entire game, but the boss dies from pillar mechanics instead of letting you actually fight him. It feels bad. Anyway, I got a robe off him that had great stats and a badly bugged texture. I knew the second I put it on that I was gonna look like a puffy marshmallow for the rest of the game, so I just accepted it and moved on. Act 3 is where things threaten to actually get interesting. The portal you cross through accidentally leads you into the cage of a gladiator pit. Oops. You don't have your spells when you're fighting in the pits, which could have been bad for me, but I had just bought that feat that lets me melee with my intelligence score, so it was fine. Eventually, a mysterious woman helps you and the slaves escape, and soon you've got a whole prison riot. The map outside of these pits and in the actual tower itself is pretty weird, because it calls itself a tower, but it's entirely horizontal. If they didn't want to make floors, they probably didn't need to make the game about a tower. It kind of took me out of it. Like, everybody's talking about how I'm ascending the Tower of Restless, but, bitch, I haven't gone up once. You meet back up with your savior, and you find out that she's a Zentarim like Restless, but part of a rival faction. You have to work pretty hard to get them to trust you, but in the end, they relent, and they allow you to come in and help them fight Restless, which doesn't end up going very well for them. Or for the dwarves or slaves who came to help. So you KO Restless on your own, and then he calls in a dragon. It's a nuisance, honestly. The hitboxes are obnoxious as hell, and no part of this was fun. Eventually, I figured out I had to get past the dragon's tail and finish everyone off through some goddamn QuickTime events. You're then treated to a final cutscene in which a very clumsy sequel is established.
Restless has fallen thanks to Ezra. How did you?
Hush, dear sister. Your conquering of the tower and the defeat of Restless has ensured that the Zentarim of Cyric will ascend as the true rulers of Daggerdale. I have no desire to kill you. But if you still plan on protecting your homeland, you will have to defeat every last one of us.
Daggerdale. It was a game. It had a few merits when it was a co-op game, but since that's gone, I gotta say, this game just sucks. I was honestly just hoping to make a giant dunk video here, but the game's low quality wasn't the sort of thing that you could show easily with just a bunch of dunks, so doing this as more of a review seemed like the right way to cover what was wrong with it. And I hope you guys have liked it, because I kinda like covering video games, honestly, so I may end up doing more of it. And if you're in the comment section anyway, then why not take a look at the like button, and then